All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. To those who are here in person, to those who are here online, thanks for joining us. So today is Wednesday. It is the 2nd of July. I'm just going to make sure it's shut. And we're getting ready for Parshas Chukas. So I would like to share with you some good sources on Parshas Chukas. I hope these will make the Parsha a bit more meaningful for us. So let's see. We got a bunch this week. Let's see if we could get them all in. So we're on page 1 right at the beginning. So Parshas Chukas begins talking about the para aduma, that red heifer. We know that that is the greatest mystery that's in the Torah. That is the paradigm of the chok. We know that there are different classifications of mitzvahs in the Torah. There are some that make all sorts of logical sense, like don't steal, don't murder, and then there are others which we just don't know why we're doing them. We don't know why they operate, why they work, other than the fact that Hashem told us that this is what's to be done. The ultimate paradigm, the ultimate, I would say, the template of the greatest chok is always referred to as the para aduma, that red heifer. And we know, just to briefly review, if someone is tamei lames, they're ritually impure because they've come into contact with the corpse. Doesn't even have to mean that they touched the corpse, but they could have shaken the hand of, let's say, someone who was on a Chevra Kadisha, who had touched the corpse, or they'd been under the same roof as one. So now they're tamei lames. So there's a purification ritual they would have to go through in order to get out of that state of ritual impurity. And there would be a certain amount of time that would have to wait. Then they would have this sprinkling on them from the paraduma. It would involve going to the mikveh as well. So let's just see a glimpse into the paraduma. So the pasuk says at the beginning of the parsha, it's in Perek Yud Tes, chapter 19. So there's pasuk Yud Zayin, verse 17. V'lachula tamei me'afar sreifas achatas. They shall take for that unclean person from the ashes of the burnt purification offering. Because remember, this paraduma is shechted and then it's burnt outside Yerushalayim. It's on the Har Zaysim looking at the Beis HaMikdash. That's where it's burnt. V'nasan alav mayim chaim al keli. And then they take ashes from that para aduma, and it will be placed into a vessel and with spring water from a fresh spring. So that is the para aduma. What aspect of the para aduma actually ends up in the solution? It's burnt up ashes. That's what ends up after it's been incinerated. It's ashes that don't have any moisture to them, don't have any aspect of the actual para aduma anymore. That's what ends up in the solution and ends up being involved in the tahara, in the purification ritual. So I want to share with you something beautiful I saw on this from Rav Moshe Sternbach in Yerushalayim. So here in his Sefer Tam V'das, he says as follows. I thought this was such a nice point. He says, Mayim Chaim El Keli, that we've got to take the ashes, we put them in this special container with this fresh spring water. Hine afara para, the ashes of this red heifer that's been totally incinerated, eno kiim zecher v'shirayim me'apara atzma. It's basically a hollow shell. It's just a fading memory of this red heifer. There once was this living, breathing, eating red cow. You could go online and see what they look like. It doesn't mean like red, like the Clifford dog. It doesn't mean red. It's almost like it's an auburn. Good. It's like an orangey brown is what it looks like. But nonetheless, even though it's not bright, shining red like Clifford, at the same token, it was a living, breathing entity. And now, what is the part that's actually playing a role in the purification process? Nothing but its dry ashes. It's a smattering. It's a memory of this great, once noble-looking red heifer that was once there. Ukfar lo nishtayer bo shum lachluchis. There's not even any moisture. There's no meat on this. Shal gufa para. In other words, it's almost like I could understand if you're going to tell me take a rack of ribs and put it in there. That's some of the para adum on there. But this ashes, it doesn't even relate to it. It's not meaty. It doesn't have any look. It doesn't have any color. It's just dried out ashes. It seems a bit odd. Uvechol zos, and he's suggesting there's a beautiful lesson here. Uvechol zos, with all that, kodesh hu, this serves the purpose of purifying the one who needs it, and it's considered sanctified. Kimi gufa kedusha hu notzer. Even though these are just mere ashes and they don't have meat on them, it's not like you're putting ribs in there, and it's not like you're putting a steak in there, and it doesn't have the red heifer look to it. But these ashes, since it was coming from the gufa kedusha, it was coming from this entity that the Torah said has the power to transmit kedusha. Kasher yischaber el mayim, and when it comes into contact with this water from the spring, yikadshu yachdav, they fuse together, and they could create kedusha, and they could sanctify someone who had been tamei lameis. Vareihem b'mala elyona shel kedusha. So here's something that, even though it was a dried, shallow shadow of its former self, coming into contact with this spring water, now it becomes this potent form of enriching kedusha. V'af yoser mina kodesh atzmo, and it becomes even more kodesh. It becomes able to transmit more kedusha than the paraduma was when it was alive. Here you have these burnt up ashes of the paraduma. If someone were to take the live paraduma, say, okay, stand in this container filled with spring water, does that create paraduma juice or paraduma solution? No, it doesn't. So these ashes, which are an incinerated form of that, which don't seemingly have no connection to it, that has the power to provide kedusha, which the cow itself, the heifer itself, didn't have. You'll see this there. Okay, so he says, what's a lesson of all this? So look at the second paragraph. This is such a powerful lesson, and it should give hope to anyone who's a member of the Jewish people. Even if it seems externally that all forms of Judaism on this person have been extinguished, they've wandered so far, they're living a life that doesn't have any connection to Judaism whatsoever. They seem to have strayed so far from the course. And it seems as if whatever moisture, whatever holy neshama that they had that could have been in their nefesh, in their spirit, it seems as if it's all dried out. They've been so estranged for so long. That's it. They're done. They're gone. There's just no hope for them. That's a false mindset that we often could have. As long as the party, no matter how far they've strayed, as long as they've got an urge, they have a willingness to try to correct course, and to bring their soul and come into contact with the waters of religion, or waters of Torah, basically, that can purify, to become close and unified again with the source of purity, which is Hashem. Muvteches lehem he's hahis alus b'malos kedosh Torah. They can be guaranteed that they will once again be able to attain a level of sanctity. Yoser mikafi asher yad tiva maseges, even more than what we think they would have been able to accomplish on their own. Coming into contact with the Torah, with those purifying waters of the Torah, has the ability to breathe life and to breathe sanctity into someone, no matter how dried out they seem to be. Therefore, no Jew should ever give up on oneself, no matter how far someone may have strayed. That person should never give up on him or herself, and that also refers to us as a third party. We should never give up on another Jew, no matter how far they seem to have gone, no matter how there's nothing in them, there's nothing there that seems to relate to that pure Jewish neshama that we know that they were gifted when they were born, or we knew them at an earlier stage in life. We should never give up on that person, no matter how dried out they may have become. Coming into contact with those purifying waters and with our Torah can reinvigorate, could reawaken and restore them, be so restorative to a level of kedusha that they may not have even had before. Even if they've already sunk into the 49th level of impurity, because every Jewish neshama was hewn, it was coming from a place, it was rooted in kedusha, and from the source of kedusha, that's where every soul was hewn from. So therefore, there's no such thing as being beyond hope. I thought that's a beautiful idea that he has, and there's the very fact that it's coming. That what are we doing? We're taking these dried out ashes, which seem to be nothing, just dust. But as soon as they come into contact with those mayim chayim, they come into contact with those living waters from that special brook the waters are drawn from to make the paraduma solution. Now all of a sudden they fuse together to create this incredibly potent force of being mitayr, of being spiritually elevating and purifying, and that should give each and every one of us the thought that we need and the mindset that we need to never give up on ourselves and never to give up on another Jew, because no matter how far we may have strayed, no matter how far another Jew may have strayed, there's still that neshama there that is ultimately coming from the ultimate source of kedusha, from Hashem. So even if it seems all dried out, coming into contact with Maim Tahorim, in this case we would say the Torah, has the ability to bring that back to life and make it into a very powerful, purifying force. I thought that's a very nice idea that Rav Staurbach had. What? Did they drink it? No, it was going to be sprinkled on them. Sprinkled on them. That the paraduma solution. Yeah.
What do we do nowadays to purify someone?
We don't have it. The best we can do is a mikvah, but we're all tamei lameis. Even a Kohen who's trying his best or her best, not to come into contact with a corpse. At the end of the day, everyone has shaken people's hands. We've all shaken the hands with someone who was in the Chevra Kadisha, and people have been under the roof of it. So a Kohen nowadays does the best that they can to avoid it. But at the end of the day, when Mashiach comes, we're all going to need to go through the purification process in order to get up on the harabayas and everything of that nature.
So we went back to the golden calf situation.
What do you mean?
I mean, they picked a calf or...
Oh, so that's a good question. So as mysterious as the para aduma is, there are various sources that offer ideas that perhaps we can grasp onto. There are many ideas that are so mysterious about the para aduma, so much about it we don't understand. But one idea that's out there is that you'll see Rashi quotes this idea, is that there's this concept that since the egel was a calf, and we sinned so terribly through the calf, so the para is the mother cow. So it's basically say it's her responsibility to help come clean up from the mess that her calf made. Rashi quotes this idea like this. If, let's say, a little kid comes into shul and makes a big mess, the first thing we do is point a finger at the parents and say, hey, that's your kid did that. Get in here with a broom and help us out, So there's this idea, Rashi quotes this idea that Yavo Ha'em, the mom should come and help cleanse and clean up Klal Yisrael from that terrible mistake that her kid caused. Now, obviously, that wasn't her biological kid. That was a golden calf, but the symbolism is there. That's what you see. And again, Rashi's not saying that as on. He quotes Chazal, the Medrash, and the Gemara, and Chazal that have that idea, but that's one. But there's so much about the paraduma we just don't understand. The most mysterious aspect about it is that people who are involved in preparing it become tamei. So here's something which has the force and the power to be mitaher, to purify others. Yet the parties, the kohanim, who are involved in preparing it, they become tamei. They have to go through the ritual cleaning process when they're done preparing that solution. So that's extremely mysterious, and it seems to be contradictory. And it says, Chazal tell us that Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of all men, he said, as much as he tried, he couldn't get to the bottom of it, even with his great intellect and all of his Torah knowledge. So there's much about, that's why Paraduma is always seen as the paradigm of the epitome of the chok, of those mitzvahs that as hard as we try, we're just never going to be able to get to the bottom of it. Okay, that's our first one for today. Let's look at the second one. So the second one, we're on the bottom of page 1. So it's the next parak in the parsha, and we're going to read something fascinating. It says that, again, remember, this is now, we do a time jump in this parsha. A lot of people can go right past us. We basically jump 38 years in this parsha, because we start off that we left Mitzrayim, we spent a year at Har Sinai, and then we start off our journey to go into the land of Israel. We had the Chet HaMeraglim 2 weeks ago we read about in Shalach, and then we had the rebellion of Korach, and then all of a sudden, now in Chukas, at a certain point, we're going to see, I believe it's at the beginning of this parak, of parak Chaf, it says that, okay, they're at the point where they're, that all of Bnei Israel are ready to now take the final steps to go into the land of Israel. And basically that means 38 years have elapsed. So in the beginning of this parsha, between Prakim, basically 38 years are elapsed. We have no idea what happened during that time, but just another reminder that the Torah is not, it tells us what we need to know, but it was never written as a history book. There's probably so much that occurred during those 38 years that we just don't know about. So anyhow, those 38 years have gone by. In this week's parsha, we're going to see Miriam passes away. We're going to see Aaron passes away. And again, that's because we're at the end of that 40-year journey. So it says they're now realizing they're getting close into entering the land of Israel. So the pasuk says, it's in Perach Chaf, we'll see on the bottom of page 1, it's Yudalit, Vayishlach Moshe malachim mikadesh el melech Edom. So they're now coming to Edom. Edom are our long-lost cousins. Those are descendants of Esav. And we're coming to the region of Edom. Some sources say that's, where Petra is in Jordan. There's all those red sandstone cliffs. Some say that that was part of Edom over there. So it says that they're now approaching the region of Edom, and they want to know, can we go through your property? You've got a highway that goes through. Can we march our people through your property so we shouldn't have to go around? So Vishlach Moshe Malachim Mikadesh El Melech Edom. Moshe says Malachim doesn't have to mean angels; it can mean messengers. So he says Moshe sends messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, and he says Ko Amar Achicha Yisrael. And he says to him as follows: So says your brother Israel. Atayadata es kol atla asher matzanu. You must have heard about it this time, all the hardships that we've been through. It's been a while since Yaakov and Esav were together, and then over the last couple hundred years, we've had quite a story. Ve'yerdu avosenu Mitzrayma. Our ancestors, starting with Yaakov, went down to Egypt. V'neshev Mitzrayim, we dwelled in Egypt, Yamim Rabim, for many days, many years. Vayeru lanu Mitzrim lavosenu, and the Egyptians mistreated us and our forefathers terribly. We're on page 2. Vanitzak el Hashem, we cried out to God. Vayishma kolenu, he heard our voices. Vayishlach malach, he sent a messenger. He translated here as an angel. He translated, he sent an angel or a messenger. Vayotzienu mitzrayim, and that angel took us out of Egypt. Who's that angel that Moshe is referring to? Huh? Himself. Right, that's what Rashi points out here. Malach doesn't have to mean angel, it can mean messenger. So Moshe is really referring to himself. He sent this messenger, and this messenger took us out of Egypt. V'hine anachnu, and now where are we? We're bekadesh ir ketzeg v'lecha. We are now encamped. All of Am Yisrael is now encamped in the area of Kadesh, which is right at the border of your kingdom. Yud Zayin, Nabra na ve'artzecha. I'm asking you, can we please pass through your land? Lo navor basadeh, and we won't step off the road. We won't step on any fields to ruin anything. Uvekerem lo nishteh, and we won't go over kerem, and we won't go through any fields or vineyards. Lo nishteh mei be'er. We won't, nor will we drink mei be'er. We won't drink well water. So I saw some of the commentators comment on that. What that means is they're saying we have our own water. We'll even enrich your people, in other words, your vendors. If you want to sell us water, we'll purchase. Derech HaMelech Nelech will go on the King's Highway. I always think of that when I'm visiting my mother-in-law in Brooklyn, and you see King's Highway there. I always think of that. So he says Derech HaMelech Nelech will go on the King's Highway. There was a road that obviously went through the land of Edom. Lo nite yamina small. We won't deviate going to the right or the left. Arasher Navar V'lecha. We just want to cut through. You have this Derech HaMelech. You have this King's Road that goes through your land. That's what we want to take to go to Israel. Vayomer love Edom, and Edom responds, Lo savor bi. You are not allowed to pass through my territory. Pen bacherav etzelek prasecha. Lest I go toward you with the sword. Meaning, if you try, I'm going to come with an army to beat you back. Yutes vayomer love b'nei Yisrael b'misilanala. They tried one more time. Said, why are you being so difficult to get along with? We'll stay on the highway. B'misilanala v'imei mecha nishteh. And if we drink any of your water, ani miknai, either the people or our animals, v'nasati machram, we'll pay for it. Well, you'll profit by us being allowed to come through your territory. Rak ein davar b'raglei avora. We're only going to pass through. It's really nothing. We're just going to pass through on a foot on your highway when it already exists. Chaf, and again, Edom sends back, Chaf vayomer lo sa'avor. No, you are not allowed to come through my territory. Vayetze Edom l'kraso ba'am kaved uviyad chazaka. And to show how they mean business, he even marches towards them with a big militia, with a big army, just to say, don't cross our border. You're going to have to fight us. Chafal vayimein Edom, and Edom refused Nesonis Yisrael avor begvulo, to let the Jewish people pass through his territory. Vayet Yisrael me'elav. Therefore, the Jews turned away, and we had to take a more circuitous route. So that's what occurs in this parsha. Edom, our cousins there, aren't too kind about our request to pass through their territory, and we're not going to fight them about that. We take a longer route. Okay, I want to share with you something beautiful that I saw here in the Aznayim LaTorah. So Rav Saratskin, here, look what he does here. He says, Vayishlach malach vayotzienu mitzrayim. We're on the bottom of page 2. So when Moshe was going through the brief history of the Jewish people, he says that we started off, we had to go down to Egypt. We were terribly mistreated in Egypt. We were slaves there. We cried out to God, and God sent a malach, which literally means an angel. It could mean a messenger, but it literally means an angel. God sent a malach and took us out of Egypt. So in Rashi says, Zeh Moshe, that's Moshe. Moshe was really referring to himself. And he says Rashi, that's what he quoted Rashi there. So now Rav Sraskin says, something doesn't sit well with me about that. Aval eich hispar anav mikol adam. What do we know about Moshe? He was just referred to as the most humble person of all men, all any human who's around. Lifnei Melech Edom, and what does he call himself? He sends his emissaries when they go to speak to the king of Edom. He sends his message, V'kara la'atzmo malach, and he refers to himself as a malach. That seems out of character for someone who's known to be the anav mikol adam. Good question. Upo iti makom. So he says, based on this question, I think I now have a spot. Lazkiras asher shamati mipi mori v'chami. I have to repeat to you a beautiful story I heard from my father-in-law, Hagon Amiti, the true sage, or Rav Eliezer Gordon Zatzal. Says that Rav Eliezer Gordon, that was his father-in-law. Who is Rav Eliezer Gordon? I've based in Varam Detels. He was the chief rabbi as well as the founding Rosh Yeshiva of the Telz Yeshiva. So Rav Eliezer Gordon was a student of Rav Yisrael Salanter and others, and he was the founder of the Telz Yeshiva in Telz, Lithuania. He was also the Rav of the town. He was also Rav Sorotskin's father-in-law. So that explains the connection between the Sorotskin family and the Telz Yeshiva, if you've ever wondered. So that's the he says, I want to tell you something I heard from my father, Rav Eliezer Gordon. He says, Maisa begon achad mi Rabbanei Vilna. There was a great story that happened with one of the sages who was one of the leading rabbis of Vilna, Kemeduma, and I believe, he says, I can't say with certainty, but I think it was Rav Aveli Fosvalar. Rav Aveli Fosvalar, someone that probably none of us have ever heard of. I tried to do a little research yesterday as to who was Rav Aveli Fosvalar. So it seems like Aveli was like a Yiddish nickname for instead of Avi. His name was probably Avram. But they would refer to him. It was at that time that seems like it was a nickname, Aveli, and his last name was Fosvaler. So if I'm correct, what I could find was he was basically the Av based in Vilna after the Gra passed away. So the Vilna Gaon passes away at the end of the 1700s. So the Vilna Gaon never held public office. He was just a sage who was sitting in his house and he was studying, and he had students who he learned with, but he wasn't holding public office. From what I could find, this Rav Aveli Fosvaler was the basically the chief rabbi in Vilna, who was serving the public after the Vilna Gaon passed away. So that's from what I could find. So again, so he says, here's the story. He once went for a walk outside the city. I guess, it was outside of Vilna. He needed to get some fresh air. So he's going for a walk outside of the city. V'ra kafri echad, and he sees a Jewish villager, Yoshev umanhig ba'agala, who's sitting in a wagon, and he's riding a wagon. Haratumalasus, and the wagon is attached to I guess its yoke is attached to two animals. A sus is a horse, uparak kishurala, and it also has a cow attached to it. What's the problem with that? Correct. The Torah tells us when it comes to kilayim, mixed species, there are several ways to have kilayim. One is what we call shatnez, is that I'm not supposed to have a garment that's got a mixture of both wool and linen that they're intertwined. Another form of kalayim is going to be planting certain types of seeds in too close proximity to one another in the field. That's agricultural kalayim. And then there's also breeding two different animal species. Those together, that's another form of kalayim. But another form that we don't automatically think about, the Torah tells us, this is in Devarim, lo sachrosh b'shor v'chamor yachdav. I'm not allowed to plow with an ox and a donkey together. I can't take two totally different animals that aren't from the same family. In other words, if I have, let's say, two different breeds of cows, that they're both cows, that's not a big deal. I've got two different breeds of horses, they're both horses. It's not a big deal. But if I have two completely different species, I got a horse, and now in this case, you're a horse and a cow, I shouldn't harness them to one wagon or to a plow and have them doing work for me. That's something that's a form of kilayim. So he says this Rav Aveli Fosvoler was going for a walk outside of Vilna once. He's getting some fresh air, and he sees a Jewish peasant who's out there, a villager, and harnessed to his wagon, he sees both a sus and a para. He sees a cow and a horse that are harnessed to this wagon. So he says, Hagon Hizira Sakafri. So he says, I can't let him violate this. He's violating a Torah principle. So he warns him. He calls out to him. He says, Rabbi, he calls out to him. He cautions this villager. Shazeh Asar Alpi Das Torah. He goes, you got to stop that. That's something that you're violating a Torah command, prohibition. Avla Kafri Lo Shamaylav. There's villagers to say, don't bother me. I got places to go, people to see. I'm not listening. And he keeps galloping along with being his wagon being pulled by a horse and a cow. Az nisa gon levayer lekafri es chomer ha'isser. Now we're on the top of page 3. So then Rav Aveli Fosvoler, he decides, okay, he's not listening when I told him the Torah forbids it. Let me explain to you just how serious that prohibition is to violate a Torah principle. V'gam zelohol. That also didn't help. This fellow wasn't interested. He had his mind made up. He wasn't interested in what this rabbi was saying to him. So now Rav Aveli Fosvoler thinking, I've got to get him to stop. This is I care about this Jew and I don't want him sitting on my watch. So he says, what am I going to do? Lavash Geus. Therefore, at that point, this Rav Aveli Fosvoler, so at that point, he cloaked himself with pride. V'amar la kafri, and he says to this villager, Hayadat mi ani, do you know who I am? Umi hu hamedaber elecha, do you understand who is speaking to you right now? Ani hu harav hayoser gadol shebevilna. I am the greatest rabbi in all of Vilna. Ushmi holech bechol hamedinos, and my name travels throughout all the countries. Everybody knows who I am. V'tekef, and I'm warning you, kasher navo Vilna, as soon as I get back to town in Vilna, achriz alecha nidoi v'shamta, I'm going to tell everyone about this terrible sin you commit in public, even after you've been made aware, and I'm going to basically put you in cherem, in excommunication. So Hakafri Nival, at that point, now the villager was startled. He tiras apara, and he detached the cow me'agala from the wagon, v'echzik esaratzua biyado, and he holds by the leash. In other words, he's not going to pull my wagon anymore. So what happened? You saw here is that this fellow wasn't listening to him when he said it's usher. He wasn't listening to him when he tried to describe how serious it is to sin. But what did make him listen? When he was scared that oh my gosh, I'm speaking to the most famous rabbi in all of Vilna, and he's going to put me in excommunication. That's what got him to observe. So he says as follows. So Rav Lazer Gordon's saying this over to Sorotskin, and he says as follows: Hare lanu, what do you see from all this? Shagon v'tzadik. Here was this Rav Aveli Fosvoler. He was a massive sage, and he was also a real tzaddik. And what did he do? Lavash geus. But at an appropriate time, he says, I've got to cloak myself with pride, v'hispaer lifnei kafri, and I've got to take out some bragging rights in front of this villager. Shehu gadol ador. He started bragging that I'm the greatest rabbi in a generation. Kedei limnoa samei avera. He had to do that in order to stop this guy. He cared about him. He didn't want him to commit an avera. So sometimes, even though we try not to be a Baal Gaiva, there are times where it might be necessary. In this case, this Rav Aveli Fosvoler says, I'm going to act with Gaiva. I'm going to act with pride. Why? Because I want to prevent another Jew from sinning. So he says, Memela Amar Le. So he says, therefore he goes, my father-in-law, Rav Lazer Gordon, says to me, Memela Amar Le, Shagam Moshe Lavash Geus Vespar. Now let's get back to our question. Our question was, how did Moshe say that God sent a malach to take us out of Egypt? That's what happened to Moshe's humility. So he's saying Moshe here is acting like Rav Aveli Fosvoler in Vilna, and Moshe is acting with Gaiva. He says, Moshe also cloaked himself with pride, and he was bragging in front of the king of Edom, Shehu Malach, and he was referring to himself as a malach, as an angel. Shashem sholcho, he's saying, I am God's messenger. God sent me. He said, "Oh, he chose me of all humans. He sent me, Lotzias Yisrael Mitzrayim, to take them out of Egypt. Kidei lahatil ema al melech Edom." Why was he doing this? Specifically because he was trying to intimidate the king of Edom. The same way that Rav Aveli Fosfiler was trying to intimidate this unlearned village Jew to stop violating Kalayim, Moshe was trying to intimidate the king of Edom to let the Jews pass through his land. That he should agree to let the Jewish people pass through his borders. And he shouldn't cause us this massive tircha, massive hassle to have to circumvent the land of Edom. Okay, it didn't help. In other words, look at this. As much as Moshe was trying, it wasn't helpful. You know why it didn't help? Because this relates back to our first of our Torah. He's saying even the fingernail of that unlearned village Jew was more chashuv than the king of Edom. Why? Because he was a neshama coming from the Jewish people. So all of a sudden he realized that he was being rebuked and he really should be sensitive to the Torah needs. Well, he was receptive to it. He may have been far gone. He could have been an Amaretz, but he was receptive to it, that village Jew, because he had a neshama. He must have had some experience with Torah and with tradition as a kid. So he was receptive. As opposed to the king of Edom, even with Moshe pulling out this pride, it wasn't effective just because he was a Russia. So now he says here, look at his last point. But look at this. This is very sensitive. Moshe is being very sensitive. Even though you can imagine how uncomfortable Moshe was asking the emissaries to use the word malach when you're referring to me. So what does Moshe do? He calls them malachim also. Because how did this whole account begin? It says, Vayishlach Moshe malachim. Right? That's the words that Moshe used to describe these messengers. It didn't say he sent shluchim. It didn't say that he sent scouts. It didn't say he sent ambassadors. He sent malachim, because a malach could mean an angel. It could also mean a messenger. So that's what he's saying. Look how sensitive Moshe is. Moshe says, I'm very uncomfortable. I have to use the term malach in describing myself now, because I'm trying to intimidate the king of Edom. But I feel very haughty asking other Jews to say that about me. So you know how I'm going to talk about you? I'm going to call you malachim also. Look at that. That's beautiful. So he says, since Moshe didn't want to pride himself by using the term malach, like he was an angel, asked the messengers to use this, the ones that he sent to the king of Edom, kina gamo sam b'shem malachim. That's why he also used that word malachim when he's referring to them. That's why the Torah writes, "Vayishlach Moshe malachim." I thought that's very nice there. So again, there's a nice question, and a nice answer, and a beautiful little story there thrown in the middle. But again, and it's someone I don't think most of us have ever heard about before. Let's see a third Dvar Torah. So we are on page 3, and third Dvar Torah in the middle of the page. So this is in Chaf Aleph. So this is right after Aaron dies. They go to Har Hahar. That's the mountain, one mountain on top of another. Aaron passes away, and immediately what you find there is Aleph. Vayishma HaKnani Melech Arad. The Knani, the inhabitants in Canaan, the king of Arad, he heard, and it says, Yoshev HaNegev, he lives in southern Israel. Kiba Yisrael Derech HaSarim. He heard that the Jews have arrived. They're at his border. They've come the same route that the spies had taken. Ve'ilachem b'Yisrael. So he does a sneak attack. He crosses in and attacks the Jewish people. Vayishp mimenu shevi. And he takes from them a captive. Shevi, that's all we're told. He took a captive. And Rashi, we don't know who that captive was. Rashi quotes a Chazal that says, and you'll see in this Tam Vidasik, Rav Sternbach again, Rav Sternbach says, Vaish mimenu shevi, that he took a captive, the Canaanim took a captive, Perish Rashi, Eino ela shifcha achas. It was one maidservant. Now, again, a maidservant, there are two different types of maids. There's a shifcha kananis, and then there's an Amma Ivris. So it's not 100% sure. Is this a Jewish Amma Ivris would be a Jewish young person who was sold into this relationship of being a maidservant? I find it hard to believe we're dealing with a Jewish maidservant at this time because the Jewish people are living in the midbar. All their needs are being taken care of by God in terms of man, water, sustenance. The only reason why a Jew would sell themselves into that relationship is because they were absolute poverty. They were stricken in poverty. Let's say you had a situation in the ancient times. There was no welfare system in place. Let's say a family was broke and they had these kids that they just couldn't provide for. They might say, I can't provide this daughter of mine with 3 square meals a day and a roof overhead and nice clothes, but I know a family there that needs help in the house. And if they're willing to take her in with that arrangement, they'll feed her, they'll clothe her, I'll visit her all the time. And they'll basically assume all sorts of parental and financial responsibility. That was the concept of an Amma Ivriya. I have a hard time believing this shifcha that Rashi's talking about as an Amma Ivriya, because why at this point in Jewish history would there have been any Jews, whose kids they needed to put in such a situation? All their needs are being taken care of by the man and all that. So it's probably when it says shifcha means a shifcha kananis. Now, even a non-Jewish shifcha, non-Jewish maidservant who may have been attached to a Jewish family, um, is a quasi-Jew in a certain sense. Every Eved Kanani, Shivcha Kananis, they can only stay in a Jewish home if they agree to keep the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, renounce idolatry, and again, if it's a man, he has to take on all the same mitzvahs that a Jewish woman would have to observe. Anything that's not a mitzvah, say Shazma Grama. And basically, they're like quasi-Jewish. It's on their way to conversion. When they become emancipated, they would become a full-fledged ger. So a Shifcha Kananis and a Eved Kanani, it has some status of almost being a member of the Jewish community. And again, the way we treat them is nowhere near when we hear or read about the awful way that slaves throughout the world, throughout history, were treated. That is in no way what the Torah allows for. The Torah has a very different understanding of what Avdus was all about. So anyhow, be that as may, Rashi says that, quoting Chazal, that when it says Vayish Mimenu Shevi, that the Canaanim took a captive. Who was this captive? So Rashi says, Eno Elo Shifcha Achas. It was one Shifcha. And what happens? They go to war over that one Shifcha that got taken captive. Klal Yisrael goes to war and they beat this king. That's what takes place in the coming psukim. So look what Rav Sternbach says here, and it just really reminds us of something. He says, "Ro imanu mizeh." We see from this account, "Godol achiyav lahatzil afilu nefesh achas miYisrael." How important it is to save one Jew. Af im eno ela shivcha achas, even if that person is only a shivcha. Again, whether that means it was a Jewish shivcha, whether it means it was a non-Jewish shivcha, there still is a connection there. Im ach nimtzeis hi b'sakanas tmiya chas v'shalom. Even if they're not in physical danger, but they're in danger of being, tmiya means like being assimilated. So here you have the shivcha who got taken captive by the king of one of the kings of Canaan. Danger is even if her life's not at risk, but her whole future is at risk. V'yatzu Yisrael lemilchama la'atzila miredes shachas. So the Jewish people rallies an army to go to war over this one shivcha. Even though you might say this isn't from the upper echelons of society, that's worth going to war for? Yes. The way to explain this is because our entire world, every Jew has a valuable role to play in Klal Yisrael. We believe the Jewish people has a very valuable role in our world, and every Jew is needed in that grand plan. ואין לנו להעריך חשיבותו ויקרו של נפש אחת מישראל. We can't do anything. There's no way to exaggerate enough about just how important every single Jew is. ועל כן, and therefore, עלינו להשתדל להתאמץ בכל כוחנו להציל נפשות ישראל. That's why we really have to go out. You always see this. There's no greater mitzvah out there than hatzalos nefashos. Whatever we can do to save another Jew, that's docha Shabbos, that's docha Yom Kippur. That's the most important ideal that's out there. And if we ever needed a reminder for that, that's what Rav Sternbach is pointing out here. If we ever needed a reminder, this is it. They went to war over what? Over a shivcha achas. One maidservant. We don't know much about that maidservant at all, but what we do know is maidservants were not from the upper echelons of society, and nonetheless, that was worthy of going to war for. We see from this how important the concept of Hatzalos Nefashos is. I think that's an important reminder out there is that as long as someone's part of Am Yisrael, we don't start saying, okay, well, what role did that person serve? Well, how connected was this person? What kind of family did he or she come from? If there's a Jew whose life is at risk and whose future is at risk, we have to act. And I think it's a nice wake up call there. Let's say share one more Dvar Torah on page 4, and this is a bit later in that parak, all the way at the end of the parsha. In fact, I think these are the last three psukim in the parsha. It says Vayifnu vayalu derech habashan. So they go up to the way of the Bashan. Vayitze Og melech habashan lekrasam hu v'chol amo lamilchama edrei. And Og, the king of Bashan, comes out with his whole chevra, and they're ready to wage war. Lamedalad vayomer Hashem Moshe. God says to Moshe, "Al tiroso, have no fear." He looks so intimidating. He's this massive warlord. You can see all these guys with their animal pelts on them, pounding their chests like these barbarians, whatever it is. So he's telling him, "Don't worry about these guys. Al tiroso, have no fear. Ki biyadcha satioso. I've given him over into your hand. Ves kol amo ves artso. Not only him, but his whole people, his whole land. Just several psukim ago, you had been victorious against Sichon. So I'm telling you, you'll also succeed against Og, these two mighty warriors. You're going to succeed. Have no fear. Go out to war and beat them. Lamed Hey, and it's a praise not just to Moshe, but to Am Yisrael that they had no fear. And they went and they beat them, totally beat them. Him, his kids, his whole nation. Ad bilti yishir lo sarid. There was no remnants to them. Vayirshu es artso, and they get their land. And that is between the land of Og and Sichon and Og. That's where Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Sheva Menashe. That's where they're going to end up the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan. So that's where they are now. The Jewish people are still on the east side of Jordan. So that's up north there, and that's where all of this fighting is taking place. They completely vanquished those two kingdoms of Sichon and Og. They end up with all that land. But what we see here in Lamed Daled in 34 was Hashem has to come to Moshe specifically and say, have no fear, don't worry about him. And Rashi picks up on that, wonders like, what was Moshe potentially worried about that God has to reassure him, say, don't worry. So let's see this Tosefes Bracha. So again, this is Rabbi Halevi Epstein, the same author of the Torah Tumima. So I've seen other Mefarshim make a similar point, but here I saw he writes it straight out. He says, Vayetze Og Melech HaBashan, and then Vayomer Hashem Moshe Al Tiroso. God tells Moshe, don't worry about him. You have nothing to fear of Og Melech HaBashan. So he quotes Rashi. Perish Rashi, Shaya Yarei. Why was Moshe fearful that now God has to reassure him? So he says, Perish Rashi, Rashi explains Shaya Yarei. Moshe was worried. Pen Tamod Lo Zechus Avram. Maybe there will be a merit that will stand up for Og, and that'll be the merit of how he had once helped Avram. Shenemar, because the Torah tells us all the way back in Lech Lecha, Vayavo hapalit vayaged laAvram ki nishba achiv, that when you had the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings, and then the 4 beat the 5, and Sdom was beaten, and all its inhabitants were taken captive, including Lot, who was Avram's nephew. So it says, Vayavo hapalit. There was one survivor of that battle who came to tell Avram and let him know that Lot was taken captive, and then Avram, gets his forces together to go attack and liberate Lot. So what role did Og play many centuries earlier? He played the role in being the one to give Avram the news that Lot had been taken captive. So now Avram could go to war and redeem his nephew Lot. That was the role that this guy had played, and because of that, that's what Rashi's explaining. That's why Moshe was worried here. You're asking me to go fight Og? Og has zechusim. He's got some merits under his belt. He was the one who gave the news to Avram. That's what he's saying. Perish Rashi, show you Yarei. Why was Moshe scared? Pentamad lo zechus Avram. Shenemar vayavo apolit vayaged Avram kinish ba'achiv. A survivor of the battle came and told Avram that his nephew was taken captive. Mitoch zeh nilcham Avram, and it was only because of that Avram went to war v'hitzeles Lot and rescued Lot. Mavur Sham, and it says over there, Rashi is explaining there, quoting Chazal, Shazah Palit Hayaog. That's that one, I guess, survivor who came to tell Avram about Lot being taken hostage. That was Og. So now that's why Moshe's worried. Next paragraph. The Yesh La'ayir, it's worth pointing out, Kisham Perish Rashi, if you actually look up that Rashi in Lech Lecha, Rashi adds another important detail. Kisham Perish Rashi, Rashi adds another detail. Why did Og come and tell Avram? Was Og so concerned about Pidyon Shvuyim? Did Og really care about Lot that he had to give Avram the news? He says, no, he said he had ulterior motives. Rashi quotes Chazal over there, V'yesh la'ir, Kisham Perish Rashi, if you look at Rashi there in Lech Lecha, Shekavanos Og, what was Og's real intent? Badasos Avram, why did he inform Avram? He wanted Avram to go off to war via Rag so that Avram would get killed, but Yisahu as Sarah. So now he would be able to marry Sarah. Og here had some real nasty, dark intentions. Og didn't care about Pidyon Shvuyim. He didn't care about Lot. He didn't care about, I've got to let Avram know because I care so much about Avram that his favorite nephew has been taken captive. That's not what he wanted to set up Avram to get killed, knowing that Avram's such a softy would march off to war. So Avram will get killed, and now I'll be able to take Sarah as a wife. Knowing that that was how Chazal understood his motivations, so then why did Moshe have any concern that his zuchusim, his merits, will stand up for him, and now I have to be nervous about going up to fight Og? Good question. Achmatzinu, what do we find? Kimaisa tov lo tinukem epnei machshava ra. Is that one doesn't negate the other. If someone does something positive, even if they had, not so good intentions, at the end of the day, if a Maisa Tova, if something positive was accomplished, then even though there were bad intentions involved, it might diminish it to some degree, but the person's still going to get credit for what they've done that's right. Kamasha Kasab and Nazir, and I'll prove this to you from Nazir. It says, and we're going to see this next week in Parshas Balak, even though Balak wanted to destroy all the Jewish people, Afal Pi Cain, even though that was his intent, he brought karbanos. Every one of those stops that he had Balak take him to, he said, make for me an altar so I can bring different types of animals as karbanos. And he got zechusim for that. Yatzamimeno Rus, Nechdaso. His great-granddaughter, Bilam's granddaughter, was Rus. And Chazal say that what merit did Rus have that she should have come from him was basically Hashem had to pay him back. Even though he had the worst of intentions, he did something right. He brought all sorts of karbanos to Hashem, so he was awarded that Rus came. L'chein, so what do you see from all this? Moshe Yareh, that's why Moshe was also worried. V'amar lo, Hashem al tiro, so God has to tell him, don't worry about it. Moshe was nervous. I know he had rotten intentions, but he did do something positive. And even though that diminishes, those rotten intentions might diminish it, it doesn't totally negate it. And therefore, he's got some zechusim. He's got some zechusim, I'm worried, to which Hashem has to reassure him and say, nah, whatever zechusim he has, it's not enough that you've got to be worried about this. You and the Jewish people will be victorious. But I think that's something good to learn about, because sometimes we're nervous about, I did a mitzvah, I did something right, but I didn't have the best of intentions. Okay, I didn't have the best of intentions, but Hashem knows I did the right thing. If we're going to wait around to act until we have absolute purity of intentions, there's going to be a lot of good deeds we're never going to get done in life because we're just not perfect. So we're not going to have perfect intentions. Let's just do what we need to do. Let's do the right thing. Hopefully, we'll get in the habit of doing the right thing enough. Our intentions will be good too at some point, but we should never let that hold us back from doing what needs to be done. Okay, so I think these are 4 different Divrei Torah that can help give us a better appreciation of Parshas Chukas and get us ready for the Shabbos and the Parsha the Sedra that's ahead. So with that, I'm gonna just stop the recording. If anyone has anything they'd like to add, please feel free to do so. If you're online, all you've got to do is